Well, let me start by thanking the organising committee. I think today has been a highly interesting day. I have to admit that when they first approached me whether I was willing to speak at a conference about safety, I have to admit I hadn't imagined that we would be talking about fighter jets. We would talk about a lot of testosterone, guys with striped t-shirts and a guitar on their back, riding on a motorbike, doing all sorts of things to women that then marry the guy on the bicycle with a helmet. But there we are. It's been a very interesting day. This is the last shift. It is called the graveyard shift, and I'm between you and the bar. But actually, if you look at it from my perspective, it is you who are between me and the bar, because the bar is behind you. So I think we'll just work on this together. My presentation today is going to be about safety, process safety management, and how to involve the workforce. Now, why are we focusing on asset integrity? I remember seeing the Piper Alpha pictures in the papers. It was 1988. It was the year of my graduation. And I thought, I couldn't really understand what happened there. Later on in '93, when I worked in Norway, I was involved in preparing the first HSE cases for Shell. And I had to read through the Cullen report, and I had to watch the videos with the interviews of the people that were actually out there. And it's something that I personally will not forget. And I think anyone that has ever seen the Cullen report videos will share that sentiment. And despite all the high-profile incidents that have happened and the lessons that we have learned over the years, accidents still do occur, although admittedly the approach that we now take to control and prevent them has evolved with time, and the frequency has changed as well. When I did that first piece of HSE work, it was a desktop piece of work. And we ended up with an HSE case for an exploration well in the Barents Sea that was about this thick. And I was very proud of the work that I had done, and I had envisaged that everyone was going to use it. Reality was it ended up somewhere on, as a doorstop, collecting dust in the office. And one of the reasons that I thought about later on, as I progressed with my career and did other jobs, was the fact that we hadn't really got it right in terms of involving the people that will actually be out there doing the work. And so this presentation will be about how we can get that process safety right, but also about how we can actually involve and when we involve people in doing that. And in order to ingrain those HSE cases or safety cases in people's day-to-day work. So what are we looking to achieve as Shell? For us, it's quite simple. We want to be able to say, and we also want to be able to believe. And I think that's more important. It's not just a matter of saying. It's a matter of the asset owner, the asset manager, to be able to believe and to go to sleep believing that the assets are safe. I spoke to the Vice President of Production in Shell Expro Aberdeen in 2003, just after we had 2 fatal accidents. And he told me, he said, the worst thing is yes, we have 2 fatalities, and that's really bad. He said, but the worst thing is that all the signals were on green. I thought everything was okay. When I now go to bed at night, I'm not sure what other platforms are out there where this could happen. And I'm quite sure Texas City, to a certain extent, people at the higher end of the management were having similar thoughts. They thought everything was hunky-dory. And so we want to be able to say and believe that our assets are safe. But what does that really mean? It means we want to design and construct our assets to ensure sustained integrity. We want to know which parts of our assets are safety critical, and we want to operate and maintain them accordingly. We want to be compliant with all the relevant standards, frameworks and procedures, and we want to be vigilant at all times, to intervene when necessary, and to make decisions that respect this vision. Now, I think the first speaker today already pointed out that if you go to a flight deck ship and you ask people, what is a plan? Well, I mean, you don't need to go to a 5,000 people population. Asking this room, what is a plan? What are the elements of a plan? You already get many different answers. So for us, it's important to, when you talk about asset integrity, it is to get the definitions right. So let's talk about definitions there. So first of all, you have asset performance. That is the ability of an asset to perform its required function while making an optimum contribution to the business. Asset integrity for us is then the ability of an asset to perform its required function effectively and efficiently while safeguarding life and the environment. You know, according to the mad Dutch professor, you know, that's the primary function of the asset. Process safety to us then means managing the major risks. Technical integrity is the management of hardware risk barriers. And this onion illustrates the different layers of protection. You build the plant, you manage the plant, you operate it, and you maintain its asset integrity, and you want it to perform. And personal safety goes across all these layers. But as has been pointed out by several speakers, you know, monitoring just the personal safety on its own is not going to tell us anything about the status of the plant. And we as operators have found that out ourselves as well. So for us, you know, this is how we look at asset integrity and process safety management. There are three areas there. It's design integrity, so we design and we build so that risks are as low as reasonably practical, right? So that's the ALARP principle. That's the design integrity. Then we have the technical integrity, which means that we maintain the hardware barriers. And then finally, you have the operating integrity, which is we work within the operating barriers, or within the operational barriers. Now, the importance is not so much in recognizing these three, but it's rather in getting them right. The other thing is, you know, it's what is in the center of this. What's in the center is the key enablers that are common to the aspects of integrity. Technical safety processes, an overarching and effective management system to monitor implementation and compliance, but most importantly, it's people. You can set up all those systems, but if you don't set them up involving the people, and if you don't set them up talking to the people who will be employing them, who are supposed to be employing them, you're not going to get that right. Now, obviously, the simple model does not capture all the complexities and subtleties of the subject, but it does highlight the key components and their relationships. And it provides an important starting point for looking at asset integrity and process safety management. So if you don't have a process in place, if you don't have a good management system, if you don't have people that understand their roles and responsibilities and know how to work with the barriers, in our view, it's not going to work. The barriers are going to fail. So the question is then, so if you look at asset integrity, you know, where does that sit in the project lifecycle? And we believe that, you know, it's not in one particular, it moves across the project lifecycle. Design integrity helps to establish asset integrity during concept selection and definition. Technical and operational integrity safeguard asset integrity during construction and operation. But design, technical, and operating integrity hang together, and one can't work properly without the other. For example, you may have thought about designing integrity during design process, but if you haven't thought about the operational aspects, your design may not have overall integrity. I think a good example of that is the mud box that we talked about this morning, the very first thing that we saw. You know, from a design perspective, it looked fine, but if you then start thinking about, well, you know, how does it actually, when you make it operational, will it work, yes or no? And then you come across a number of things that, you know, may not have been so obvious. So for us, applying the HEMP assessment and developing HSE cases as early as possible will work further down the chain. And they will drive the identification of safety critical elements and roles throughout the design, construction and operational phases. And so, you know, to conclude on this slide, this is about making sure that we address this right from the start rather than as an afterthought. So how do you bring this into practice then? So what are the must-wins that people have to get right in any of those three phases? Now, during the design and the construct phase, there are several steps. We select the design to minimize the risks, and then we identify ways to mitigate the risks. And we do that with the people who are going to be operating this thing. So we employ the hazards and effects management process, whereby we systematically identify the hazards, assess the risks, identify the safety critical elements during the hemp studies, and then design the risk barriers. And everything is formally documented in the design and operation HSE cases, right? Out of that, you then pull together this plan to operate, and you have a number of things that you use in your day-to-day work, such as the permit to work system. So once operating, we maintain the risk barriers, for instance, through maintenance and inspection programs and permit to work controls. And then there's a feedback loop when operating to make sure that you check that the barriers are still adequate. And the operating HSC case, you know, rather than it being the book stop that I developed back in '93, really ought to be a lifetime HSC case. So you have to see that thing as something that is alive, that you update based on all the inspections that you do, all the feedback that you get from the platform. So what activities are part of the must-win? What is it that we're doing then? This schematic here depicts the journey that many of the existing assets in EP are on. We see that despite the best intentions of designing and operating assets at a certain level, you know, the actual integrity level goes down over time for various reasons. It may be complacency, it may be equipment breakdown, certain things are not going to be reported, or there may be a maintenance backlog. Interestingly enough, if you looked at the last slide that you showed there, there was quite a backlog on the maintenance on their slide, which to us would be one of the things that would set all the alarm bells go off. So when you assess the integrity status of your assets, you will find that it is much lower than you expected or hoped it would be, and certainly it's not going to live up to the level that you had originally designed it to be. So, you know, what to do then is to find out where an asset is and what it will take to get it back on track for further operations over the remaining life of the field. And that's an important thing as well. It's to think about, you know, you have to bring it back for the remaining life of the field. So if the field is only going to be there for another 2 to 3 years, then the amount of effort you're going to put into it is not going to be the same as, you know, if it's a field that's going to be there for another 15 years. So you need to understand the state of the kit by making a full and a detailed assessment of the status of the integrity. We do that in Shell by running through a focused asset integrity review, whereby we look at the status of the facility. And the focus of such reviews is to establish the status of the safety critical elements, which means checking those pieces of equipment where failure could potentially lead to a major HSE incident. And then the analysis is going to provide a full scope for what it will take to bring the facility well or pipeline back to the unrestricted future operations. So the actual review is not ending with a report of, well, this is the status. No, the actual review ends with a workshop which says, right, and what is it that we're going to be doing, or what is it that the operator will do in order to get things back in order? Now, you can fix things, for example, you know, by training or addressing equipment issues and all sorts of other things. But if you're not careful, if you don't change how you actually work, then your asset integrity will go down the same slope again. So you fix it, but if you haven't really changed, you know, the only reason why you're down there is because somehow the way you operate, you know, isn't working out the way it should be. And if you don't really realize that, and if you don't address that, then you can do a quick fix, but then over a span of 12 to 24 months, your asset will be back down again to the level where you assessed it. So actually, the recovery road needs to be defined and to be materialized, and that normally, actually, for certain assets, can take the form of a large project. The sustain bit, you know, in order to deliver sustained asset integrity, you need to rethink the way you work that asset. So, for instance, you know, make the maintenance of integrity an integral part of what people do in their everyday work. And to a certain extent, this relates back to the presentation made by Statoil. Leaders, engineers, supervisors, operators all need to be aware. You know, this is not a matter of saying, oh, well, you guys are not doing your work. No, and it's not a matter of pointing to leadership saying, well, you know, you're not pointing us in the right direction. This is something where, you know, maybe the A-team approach is required. So if someone finds something that needs to be improved, they have to see that it actually gets picked up and is worked on. And make no mistake, I mean, our experience is that this is probably the most difficult bit of that whole journey. Assessing the state of your asset is the easiest bit. It may be very painful in realizing where you've let it go, but actually bringing it back up and keeping that performance up is much, much harder. So, assessing means understanding the issues, assessing the current condition of the barriers. The next step is fixing, and that means restoring, repairing or replacing barriers to address gaps, and validating or updating barriers or performance standards, in our case in SUP. And to sustain means improving the planning and execution of maintenance using SUP, implementing new reporting to enable real-time transparency, improving staff capabilities, making sure that these people are all trained and competent to do that, and overlay that with a layer of competency management and emphasizing the appropriate culture and behaviors. This one you've seen, the Swiss cheese model. Central to maintaining asset integrity is understanding and managing risk. So it's not a matter of making sure there are no holes in any of those barriers. There are holes in those barriers. And risk, I can't recall which speaker it said, risk in itself is not, is not intolerable. But it's a matter of being aware of where the holes are and why there are holes in some of these barriers. And it's to think about the fact that actually, no, it's not me just thinking about my little barrier. No, if we are an asset team, we have to think from a team perspective about how barriers hang together and whether or not holes can line up and what the potential consequences that can be. So barriers are in place to ensure safe operation, and weakness in the barriers can be likened to the holes in the Swiss cheese. And usually one or other of the barriers prevents the major or top event from happening, but eventually all the holes may line up and lead to an accident, or worse, a major event. And then, as I said, the holes are not static. They change, they continue to alter in size, and they move. And our thinking is that the hole and their size is also going to be dependent on the experience of the crew. There is no perfect barrier. And the HSE case for each asset describes the risks of a significant incident, the safety critical elements, and the necessary barriers, and also how you should inspect them on a regular basis and maintain them. The weaker the controls, the bigger the holes. Now, each identified risk has barriers or safety critical elements in place to manage risk to be as low as reasonable practical. And Shell has identified all these safety critical elements. That does not mean that when we go out to an asset, we just pull out our list of safety critical elements and start ticking them off. No, you have to take the situation into the equation as well. And not, each asset is going to be a situation on its own. So you have to think about which of these barriers are actually applicable for that particular asset. Now, busy slide. For us, as part of the hazard and effect management process, we use a full bow tie assessment to analyze and evaluate the risks for major accident hazards, accidents with mortal fatalities or catastrophic consequences. And the bow tie illustrates the relationship between the various components that result from the HEMP. They depict the relationship between hazards, threats, barriers, escalation factors, controls, consequences, recovery preparedness, and HSE critical elements and tasks. The importance is in preparing those bow tie diagrams, as we call them, with the staff, and making sure that they also start to understand how things hang together and why it is important to have that picture in your mind all the time. Each barrier, control, and recovery preparedness measure should have as a minimum one supporting task to ensure that the integrity of each is maintained. And these are termed safety or HSE critical tasks and must be performed by responsible and competent persons. Right? So you have to be able to identify who's responsible or accountable for performing certain tasks, and you have to make sure that that person is actually well trained to do that job. Now, for us, in our operations, we see this as a powerful way of involving the workforce. We can all sit in the office and make these diagrams, but the best way is to actually involve the workforce. They are knowledgeable people. You know, they are people that are out there. They know how things work. They know how things work in practice versus how things work in theory. Right? And we shouldn't underestimate the know-how that sits with them. And not just them, but also some of the service contractors that we use on our assets. Don't underestimate the value of what they can add to your picture. So that takes me to the final slide. I'm sure you'll be happy to hear. It's a summary. It's a summary of those things that we think we should get right. So we design our facilities to keep risk levels a LARP. We continuously assess our assets to ensure that barriers are maintained and tested. And we operate our facilities within the envelope set for them. And this allows us to safely operate an asset and optimize it without compromising integrity. And central to this all is having a competent workforce that knows what to do since they've been involved defining and designing the integrity right off the bat. So that was my presentation. I'll be happy to take any questions if you wish. That can be either here or it can be later in the bar. Thank you very much.